The sobs racked her body as the last passengers disembarked from the train, leaving Eleanor Greenfield alone on the wooden bench at Ardmore Station. The Oklahoma sun beat down mercilessly, as if determined to amplify her humiliation. Her white wedding dress, once pristine and filled with promise, was now stained with the dust of the journey and the tears that wouldn't stop falling. The man who had promised to make her his wife, the man who had courted her through letters for nearly a year, had simply not shown up. The station emptied quickly as the passengers dispersed into waiting carriages or walked toward the bustling main street of Ardmore. Eleanor remained, her valise and trunk beside her, uncertain where to go or what to do next. Her family was thousands of miles away in Boston. She had exactly $17.43 to her name, a trousseau of dresses suitable for a rancher's wife, and absolutely nowhere to turn. "Excuse me, miss," a deep voice spoke above her. "Are you waiting on someone?" Eleanor looked up through tear-swollen eyes to see a tall man in a dust-covered denim jacket, worn boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded most of his face. His posture was relaxed but alert, like that of someone accustomed to watching horizons. A cowboy. "No," she managed to say, her voice breaking. "No one is coming for me." The man glanced around the nearly deserted platform, then back to her wedding dress. Understanding dawned in his eyes she now noticed were a startling shade of blue against his sun-weathered skin. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty space beside her on the bench. Eleanor nodded stiffly, trying to compose herself, though it seemed futile at this point. The cowboy sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Name's Matthew Archer," he said, removing his hat and placing it on his knee. His dark hair was cropped short on the sides but longer on top, with a slight curl that betrayed its rebellious nature when not confined beneath the hat. "I work at the Lazy S Ranch outside of town." "Eleanor Greenfield," she replied automatically, the way she'd been taught to introduce herself since childhood. "I was to be," her voice faltered. "Well, it appears I am to be nothing now." Matthew nodded slowly, seeming to weigh his words carefully before speaking. "Don't know what happened, miss, but I reckon anyone who'd leave you waiting at a train station isn't worth those tears." A fresh wave of humiliation washed over Eleanor. "You don't understand. I traveled all the way from Boston. Douglas Mr. Crawford, he wrote such beautiful letters. We were to be married today." She gestured helplessly at her gown. "He promised to meet me here, to take me to the judge and then to his ranch outside of town." "Crawford?" Matthew frowned. "Douglas Crawford, who owns the Triple C," Eleanor nodded. "Do you know him?" The muscles in Matthew's jaw tightened. "Know of him. His ranch borders Lazy S." He paused, then said with careful neutrality, "He has a reputation around these parts." "Apparently for not keeping his promises," Eleanor said bitterly, wiping away a fresh tear. Matthew stared down at the hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly. "Miss Greenfield, I don't know how to tell you this gently, but Douglas Crawford got married 3 weeks ago to Harriet Miller, the banker's daughter." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The platform seemed to tilt beneath her. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I received a letter from him just last month confirming our arrangement. He sent money for my train ticket." "I'm sorry," Matthew said, and the genuine sympathy in his voice was what finally broke the dam of Eleanor's composure. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with sobs. She felt him shift on the bench, uncertain, then a tentative hand patted her shoulder. "Miss Greenfield," he said quietly, "Eleanor, you can't stay here all night. Do you have anywhere to go, anyone you can contact?" "No," she managed between sobs. "My parents are dead. I sold everything to come here. I have no home to return to." Matthew was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Wait here," he said. "Don't move, I'll be right back." Too exhausted to argue or even wonder where he might be going, Eleanor simply nodded. She watched through tear-blurred vision as his tall figure strode away, boots echoing on the wooden platform. She expected him to disappear forever, just another stranger briefly intersecting with her ruined life before continuing on his way. Instead, to her surprise, he returned less than 15 minutes later, accompanied by an older woman with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes. Eleanor Greenfield, this is Mrs. Rosa Martinez. She runs the boarding house on Elm Street, Matthew said. The woman's face was lined with the evidence of both laughter and sorrow, her sturdy frame wrapped in a practical dark blue dress. She clicked her tongue sympathetically as she took in Eleanor's wedding dress and tear-stained face. "Oh, child," Rosa said, her voice carrying the gentle lilt of a Spanish accent. "Mr. Archer has told me what happened. You will come with me now. I have a clean room and a hot meal waiting." Eleanor looked between them, bewildered by this unexpected kindness. I don't have much money," she admitted. Rosa waved away the concern. "We will speak of that later. For now, you need rest and food." Matthew stepped forward and picked up Eleanor's trunk with ease. "I'll carry these for you if that's all right." Too drained to protest, Eleanor nodded and gathered her smaller valise. As they walked away from the station, she cast one last glance back at the empty platform where her dreams had shattered just hours before. "Douglas Crawford is a fool," Matthew said quietly, falling into step beside her. "And a dishonorable man. I'm sorry you had to learn that the hard way." "Why are you helping me?" Eleanor asked, genuinely confused by his continued presence. "You don't even know me." Matthew considered this for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "My ma used to say that the measure of a person isn't how they treat folks they know, but how they treat strangers in need." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Eleanor managed, touched by the simple philosophy. He corrected gently. "But yes, she was the wisest person I ever knew." They walked in silence the rest of the way to the boarding house, a neat two-story building with a wide porch and window boxes filled with vibrant flowers. Inside, Rosa showed Eleanor to a small but clean room on the second floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the back garden. "Rest now," Rosa instructed. "When you are ready, come downstairs. Food will be waiting." When the older woman left, Matthew set down Eleanor's trunk and turned to go. "Mr. Archer," Eleanor called, stopping him at the doorway. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." Her voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Don't mention it," he said, shifting uncomfortably under her gratitude. "I'll be checking in tomorrow if that's all right. Got some ideas about work you might be able to find in town." After he left, Eleanor sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the events of the day. She was stranded in a strange town, betrayed and abandoned. Yet the simple kindness of a stranger had provided a momentary shelter from the storm. As she finally peeled off her wedding dress, the dress that had been meant to mark the beginning of her new life, she wondered what tomorrow would bring in this wild, unpredictable land. Matthew couldn't get the image of Eleanor Greenfield's tear-streaked face out of his mind as he rode his horse back to the Lazy S Ranch. The setting sun painted the Oklahoma sky in shades of orange and purple, but the beauty was lost on him. His thoughts remained with the abandoned bride and her heartbreaking story. Douglas Crawford's reputation as a wealthy, hard-drinking womanizer was well known in Ardmore and the surrounding ranches. But to court a woman from back east, convince her to travel all this way, and then marry someone else without so much as a letter of explanation, that was a new low, even for Crawford. The Lazy S came into view as Matthew crested the last hill, a sprawling ranch with a main house, bunkhouse, barn, and corrals spread across the landscape. It wasn't the biggest operation in the territory, but under the ownership of Samuel Shaw, it was one of the most respected. Matthew dismounted at the stables and led his horse inside, where he began the familiar routine of removing the saddle and brushing down the animal. "There you are," a voice called from the stable door. James Miller, one of the other ranch hands and Matthew's closest friend, leaned against the doorframe. "Boss was wondering where you'd gotten to after you delivered those papers to town." "Got held up," Matthew replied, continuing his work. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "Found a woman crying at the train station. Bride left at the altar, or the station more like." James whistled low. "That's harsh. Who was the no-show groom?" Douglas Crawford. James's expression hardened. "That snake, what you do with her?" Took her to Rosa's boarding house. She's got nowhere to go, no family to speak of. Matthew hung the brush on its hook and patted his horse's flank. Thought maybe Mrs. Shaw might know of some work for her in town. She seems educated, well-spoken. Sounds like you're mighty concerned about a stranger, James observed with a knowing look. Matthew frowned. Anybody with a heart would be. You didn't see her, James, looking like her whole world just collapsed. Uh-huh, James said, unconvinced. And the fact that she's pretty had nothing to do with it. I never said she was pretty, Matthew pointed out. James grinned. Didn't have to. It's written all over your face, Archer. Matthew threw a currycomb at his friend, which James caught easily with a laugh. Go on and laugh, Matthew said, but that woman deserves better than being left stranded in a strange town with nothing but a wedding dress and a broken heart. And you're going to make sure she gets it? James asked, his teasing tone softening. Matthew shrugged, uncomfortable with his friend's scrutiny. Just trying to help her find her feet is all. That night, as he lay in his bunk in the ranch hand's quarters, Matthew found himself wondering what Eleanor was doing now. Was she sleeping, or lying awake in that strange bed, trying to make sense of her shattered plans? He remembered the way her green eyes had flashed with hurt and anger when he'd told her about Crawford's marriage, the quiet dignity she'd tried to maintain even as tears streamed down her face. There was something about her that struck him, not just her obvious beauty, with her honey blonde hair and delicate features, but a certain resilience beneath the fragility. A woman who would sell everything and travel across the country to marry a man she'd only known through letters had courage, even if her judgment might be questionable. As sleep finally claimed him, Matthew made a silent promise to himself that he would do whatever he could to help Eleanor Greenfield find her place in Ardmore or wherever else she might choose to go. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Eleanor woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed in one of the few day dresses. She'd packed a simple blue cotton that had seemed appropriate for life as a rancher's wife and made her way downstairs. Rosa was in the kitchen, kneading dough with strong, flour-covered hands. She looked up as Eleanor entered and smiled warmly. "Ah, you are awake. Sit, sit. I will make you breakfast." "Please, let me help," Eleanor said, uncomfortable with being waited on. "I'm quite capable in a kitchen." Rosa studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, you can slice the bread once it has cooled and perhaps set the table. We have 2 other boarders who will be down soon." Eleanor worked alongside the older woman, grateful for the distraction of domestic tasks. As they prepared the meal together, Rosa gently probed for more information about Eleanor's background and circumstances. "I was a teacher in Boston," Eleanor explained as she set plates around the small dining table. "After my parents died of influenza last year, I had to leave our home. I couldn't afford the rent on my teacher's salary. When Douglas began writing to me, it seemed providential." "How did you come to know this man?" Rosa asked, her tone careful but curious. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "He answered an advertisement I placed in a matrimonial newspaper. It sounds foolish now, but it's not uncommon in the East. Many women seek husbands in the Western Territories this way." "It is not foolish to seek a better life," Rosa said firmly. "It is only foolish to believe all men are honorable." Before Eleanor could respond, the front door opened and Matthew Archer stepped into the boarding house, removing his hat as he entered. The sight of him tall and straight-backed in the morning light sent an unexpected flutter through Eleanor's chest, which she immediately attributed to surprise. "Good morning," he said, nodding to both women. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Never," Rosa assured him. "You are just in time to join us for breakfast." Eleanor noticed he'd changed from yesterday's dusty clothes into a clean shirt and denim trousers, though his boots were still worn from long days in the saddle. His dark hair was damp, as if he'd recently washed it. "Miss Greenfield," he greeted her with a slight bow of his head. "How are you feeling today?" "Better, thank you," she replied, smoothing her skirts nervously. "And please call me Eleanor. After your kindness yesterday, formality seems unnecessary." "Eleanor," he repeated with a small smile. "And I'm Matthew, not Mr. Archer." Two more people joined them for breakfast, an elderly gentleman who Rosa introduced as Mr. Peterson, a retired shopkeeper, and a young woman named Sarah Wilson who worked as a seamstress in town. Both were politely curious about Eleanor, but to her relief, neither pressed for details about her situation. After breakfast, Matthew asked if Eleanor would accompany him for a walk through town. "I spoke with my employer's wife this morning," he explained as they strolled down Ardmore's Main Street. "Mrs. Shaw knows most everyone around here, and she mentioned the school might be looking for a teacher's assistant." Eleanor's heart lifted at the news. "Truly. I have several years of teaching experience." "That's what I figured when you mentioned Boston," Matthew said. "Folks around here respect education, even if many of them haven't had much of it themselves." As they walked, Matthew pointed out the various businesses: the general store, the bank, the sheriff's office, the small church, and finally the schoolhouse at the edge of town. It was a simple one-room building, but well-maintained, with a bell tower and freshly painted white clapboard siding. "School term starts in 2 weeks," Matthew explained. "Mrs. Porter has been teaching here for years, but she's getting on in age and has been asking for help." A middle-aged woman was sweeping the schoolhouse steps when they approached. She looked up, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Morning, Mrs. Porter," Matthew called. "Got someone here I'd like you to meet." The teacher set aside her broom and came to greet them, her gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her face kind and intelligent. Matthew made the introductions, explaining Eleanor's background without mentioning the circumstances that had brought her to Ardmore. "A trained teacher from Boston." Mrs. Porter's eyes lit up. "My dear, you're overqualified to be my assistant, but I would be delighted to have your help. The town has grown considerably in the past few years, and I now have nearly 40 students of various ages." Eleanor felt a surge of hope. "I would be honored to assist you, Mrs. Porter. When might I start? Why not now? Come inside and we can discuss the particulars." Matthew tipped his hat. "I'll leave you ladies to it then. Eleanor, I'll come back around noon to walk you back to Rosa's if that suits." "That's very kind of you," Eleanor said, genuinely touched by his continued concern for her welfare. "Thank you, Matthew." As he walked away, Mrs. Porter gave Eleanor an appraising look. "Matthew Archer is one of the finest young men in the territory," she remarked, "honest to a fault and hardworking. His mother was my dear friend before she passed." "He's been very kind," Eleanor said carefully, uncertain why the older woman was sharing this information. Mrs. Porter simply nodded and led the way into the schoolhouse. The interior was basic but well organized, with rows of desks facing a larger teacher's desk at the front. Bookshelves lined one wall, modestly filled with worn volumes. "Our resources are limited compared to what you're accustomed to in Boston," Mrs. Porter said, "but the children are eager to learn." For the next several hours, Eleanor forgot her troubles as she and Mrs. Porter discussed teaching methods, curriculum, and the particular challenges of educating children of various ages and backgrounds in a single classroom. By the time Matthew returned at noon, they had agreed that Eleanor would begin the following Monday with a modest salary supplemented by room and board at the boarding house, which the school board would subsidize. "It's not wealth, Mrs. Porter cautioned, but it's a respectable position and enough to live on comfortably in Ardmore." "It's more than I could have hoped for yesterday," Eleanor replied honestly. When she stepped outside with Matthew, she felt lighter than she had since arriving in Oklahoma. "Mrs. Porter is wonderful," she told him as they walked back toward town. "And the opportunity is perfect. I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks," Matthew said. "Just glad it worked out." They walked in companionable silence for a few moments before Eleanor gathered her courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her since the previous day. "Matthew, do you think? That is, should I confront Douglas Crawford about what he did?" Matthew's steps faltered and he turned to look at her with surprise. "You want to face him?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants answers, part of me never wants to see him again. But I traveled all this way because of his promises, and he owes me at least an explanation, doesn't he?" Matthew's expression darkened. "Crawford isn't the type to admit he's wrong about anything. Confronting him might just bring you more pain." Perhaps, Eleanor said quietly, but I'm not sure I can move forward without closure. Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. If that's what you need, I understand, but don't go alone. I'll take you out to the Triple C whenever you're ready. You would do that? Eleanor asked, touched by his offer. I said I'd help you, didn't I? His blue eyes held her steadily. And I keep my promises. The simple statement, contrasted with Douglas's broken vows, sent a wave of emotion through Eleanor. She blinked back unexpected tears and nodded. Thank you. I'll think about when I might be ready for such a meeting. As they continued their walk back to the boarding house, Eleanor found herself studying Matthew's profile surreptitiously. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and those striking blue eyes that seemed to see more than most. But it was his quiet decency that drew her the way he had sat beside a crying stranger and simply stayed, offering help without expectation of reward. For the first time since arriving in Ardmore, Eleanor wondered if perhaps fate had a different plan for her than the one she'd envisioned. The thought was both frightening and strangely comforting. The next few days settled into a pattern. Eleanor spent her mornings at the schoolhouse with Mrs. Porter, preparing for the upcoming term. In the afternoons, she helped Rosa at the boarding house to earn her keep until her teaching salary began. And nearly every day, Matthew found some reason to stop by bringing news of town happenings, offering to show her more of Ardmore or simply checking that she was adjusting well. 5 days after her arrival, Eleanor decided she was ready to confront Douglas Crawford. She mentioned her decision to Matthew when he stopped by the boarding house that evening. "Are you certain?" he asked, concern evident in his expression. "You've only just begun to find your footing here." "I'm certain," Eleanor said firmly. "I need to do this before the school term begins and my new life truly starts. I can't carry this unfinished business with me." Matthew nodded slowly. "All right, I have tomorrow off from ranch duties. I'll borrow a buggy and come for you in the morning." The next morning dawned clear but cooler than previous days, with a hint of autumn in the air despite it being only late August. Eleanor dressed with care in her finest day dress of forest green that complemented her eyes and pinned her hair in a simple but elegant style. If she was to face the man who had humiliated her, she would do so looking her best. Matthew arrived promptly at 9, driving a well-maintained buggy pulled by a handsome bay horse. He jumped down to help Eleanor up, his touch on her elbow gentle but firm. "You look nice," he said simply, then seemed immediately embarrassed by the observation. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, hiding a smile at his discomfort. "How far is the Triple C Ranch?" "About an hour's drive," Matthew answered as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. Crawford's place is one of the largest in the area, nearly 10,000 acres. As they traveled, the town of Ardmore gave way to open countryside, with rolling hills covered in prairie grasses and the occasional stand of trees marking creek beds. Matthew pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area's history, clearly trying to keep Eleanor's mind off the confrontation ahead. She appreciated his efforts, but as the Triple C Ranch came into view, a sprawling complex with a grand 2-story main house, multiple barns, corrals, and outbuildings, her anxiety returned full force. "You don't have to do this," Matthew reminded her softly as they approached the main house. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Yes, I do." Matthew tied the horse at a hitching post, then helped Eleanor down from the buggy. They climbed the steps to the wide veranda that wrapped around the house, and Matthew knocked firmly on the ornate front door. A maid in a black uniform with a white apron answered, eyeing them curiously. "May I help you?" "We're here to see Mr. Crawford," Matthew said, his tone polite but firm. "Please tell him Eleanor Greenfield wishes to speak with him." The maid's eyes widened slightly at Eleanor's name, and she glanced nervously between them before nodding. "Please wait here." She disappeared inside, leaving Eleanor and Matthew standing on the porch. Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was certain Matthew must hear it, but he simply stood beside her, a reassuring presence in the face of her tumultuous emotions. Several minutes passed before the door opened again, but instead of Douglas Crawford, a young woman appeared. She was petite with dark hair and expensive clothing, her pretty face set in suspicious lines. "I'm Harriet Crawford," she announced, her gaze fixed on Eleanor. "My husband isn't available. Whatever business you have with him can be conducted through me." Eleanor felt her face flush with humiliation. This was Douglas's new wife, the woman he had chosen instead of her. She struggled to find her voice, but Matthew spoke first. "Mrs. Crawford, your husband invited Miss Greenfield to Oklahoma with the promise of marriage. She arrived 5 days ago to find he had already married you. I believe she deserves the courtesy of an explanation directly from him." Harriet's face paled, then flushed with anger. "That's absurd. Douglas would never—" "It's not absurd, Mrs. Crawford," Eleanor interrupted, finding her courage at last. "I have all his letters. He sent money for my train ticket just 6 weeks ago." "Letters can be forged," Harriet snapped, "and anyone could have sent money." "Harriet, that's enough," a male voice called from inside the house. A moment later, Douglas Crawford himself stepped onto the porch. He was tall and undeniably handsome, with golden hair and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to wealth and power. But as his gaze met Eleanor's, she saw not the romantic figure she had imagined from his letters, but a cold calculation in his eyes that sent a chill through her. "Miss Greenfield," he acknowledged with a curt nod. His gaze shifted to Matthew and his expression hardened further. "Archer. You're a long way from the lazy S. I escorted Miss Greenfield here at her request," Matthew replied evenly. "Seemed the least I could do after finding her abandoned at the train station in her wedding dress." Harriet gasped, looking at her husband with growing horror. "Douglas." Crawford's jaw tightened. "Go inside, Harriet. This doesn't concern you." "It most certainly does concern me if you were planning to marry another woman 6 weeks after our wedding," Harriet exclaimed, her voice rising. "I said go inside," Crawford snapped. Harriet stared at him for a long moment, then turned and stormed into the house, slamming the door behind her. Crawford turned his attention back to Eleanor, his expression now a careful mask of regret. "I apologize for any confusion, Miss Greenfield. Our correspondence ended months ago when I informed you I could not proceed with our arrangement." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "That's a lie. I have your letters, all of them. The last one was dated July 15th, confirming our plans. You never broke off our engagement." "I think you'll find that your word against mine counts for very little in Ardmore," Crawford said, his voice hardening. "Now, I suggest you return to wherever you came from and stop spreading these malicious falsehoods about me." Eleanor felt a surge of righteous anger replace her hurt. "You're a coward, Mr. Crawford. You led me to believe we had a future together, then left me stranded without so much as a message of explanation." Crawford's face darkened with anger. "You'd be wise to watch your accusations, Miss Greenfield. I'm an influential man in this territory." "Are you threatening her?" Matthew stepped forward, his body tense. Crawford smiled coldly. "Just stating facts, Archer. Now take your friend and get off my property before I have you removed." Eleanor placed a restraining hand on Matthew's arm. "He's not worth it," she said quietly. Then, looking directly at Crawford, she continued, "I came here seeking answers, but I see now there are none to be had from a man without honor. I pity your wife, Mr. Crawford, and I thank God I was spared from becoming her." With that, she turned and walked back to the buggy, her head held high despite the trembling in her legs. Matthew followed after one last hard look at Crawford. As they drove away from the Triple C, Eleanor finally allowed the tears to fall, not tears of heartbreak this time, but of relief and anger. "I'm sorry," Matthew said gently. "That can't have been easy." "Actually," Eleanor replied, wiping away her tears, "it was exactly what I needed. I came to Oklahoma believing I loved that man, but I never really knew him at all, did I? I fell in love with words on a page, not the person who wrote them." Matthew was quiet for a moment, then said, "Some men are skilled at showing the world only what they want it to see." "And others," Eleanor said softly, looking at Matthew's profile against the open sky, "show their true character in the smallest acts of kindness." A flush crept up Matthew's neck at her words, but he didn't reply. Instead, he guided the buggy off the main road toward a small creek lined with cottonwood trees. "Thought you might like a moment to collect yourself before heading back to town," he explained as he brought the horse to a stop in the shade. "There's a nice spot by the water where we can sit for a while." They walked together to the creek bank, where a fallen log provided a natural bench overlooking the clear, shallow water. The sound of the flowing stream and rustling leaves created a peaceful backdrop to Eleanor's turbulent thoughts. "When I first saw you at the station," Matthew said after they'd been sitting in companionable silence for several minutes, "I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever met." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "Brave?" I was crying like a child. "Yes, but you traveled across the country alone to start a new life in a place you'd never seen, with a man you'd never met. That takes courage, Eleanor, regardless of how it turned out." His words warmed something inside her that had been cold since her arrival in Ardmore. "I don't feel very brave, I feel foolish." "We're all foolish sometimes," Matthew said with a small smile. "It's how we recover from our foolishness that matters." Eleanor studied him curiously. "You sound like you speak from experience." Matthew picked up a small stone and tossed it into the water, watching the ripples spread outward. "When I was 20, I left the ranch where I'd grown up to seek my fortune in the gold fields of California. Spent 2 years panning rivers and breaking my back for nothing but a handful of dust and a lot of hard lessons." "What brought you back?" Eleanor asked. "My mother's illness. Got a letter saying she didn't have long, so I came home." His expression softened with memory. "She lived another year after that, long enough to see me settle back into honest work. She made me promise not to chase rainbows when there was good, solid earth beneath my feet." "Wise advice," Eleanor murmured. "She was a wise woman," Matthew agreed. "Raised me alone after my father was killed in a cattle drive when I was 10. Taught me everything important I know about living right." As they talked, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Eleanor found herself relaxing for the first time since her confrontation with Crawford. There was something about Matthew's quiet strength and unassuming manner that soothed her wounded pride and gave her hope for the future, a future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities rather than disappointments. When they finally returned to the buggy to continue their journey back to Ardmore, Eleanor felt a lightness in her spirit that had nothing to do with confronting Douglas Crawford and everything to do with the man sitting beside her, guiding the horse with gentle, capable hands. The weeks that followed brought a steady rhythm to Eleanor's new life in Ardmore. The school term began, and she found herself thoroughly enjoying her work with Mrs. Porter and the children. Her experience in Boston had prepared her well for teaching, but the diverse backgrounds of her Ardmore students, from the children of wealthy ranchers to those of shopkeepers, farmers, and laborers, presented unique challenges and rewards. At the boarding house, she formed a friendship with Sarah Wilson, the young seamstress who helped her adapt her Boston wardrobe to the more practical needs of Oklahoma life. Rosa became a maternal figure, offering wisdom and comfort on the occasions when homesickness struck. And then there was Matthew. His visits became a regular part of Eleanor's week, sometimes just brief stops to say hello when he was in town on ranch business. Other times longer visits where they might walk together or share a meal at the small cafe on Main Street. He introduced her to his friend James and other residents of Ardmore, helping her build connections in her new community. Eleanor learned that Matthew was respected throughout the area, not just for his skill with horses and cattle, but for his integrity and willingness to help others. She heard stories of how he'd spent 3 days searching for a lost child the previous winter, how he taught the younger ranch hands to read during evening hours, and how he regularly checked on elderly residents who lived alone outside town. The more she learned about him, the more her admiration grew. And with that admiration came feelings. She hadn't expected a quickening of her pulse when she spotted him riding into town, a warmth in her chest when he smiled at something she said, a lingering awareness of his presence whenever he was near. By mid-September, Eleanor had to admit to herself that she was falling in love with Matthew Archer. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. Her judgment in matters of the heart had proven disastrously flawed with Douglas Crawford. Could she trust these new feelings? Moreover, while Matthew was unfailingly kind and attentive, he had given no clear indication that his feelings went beyond friendship. He treated her with respect and care, but he maintained a careful distance that left Eleanor uncertain of his true feelings. On a golden afternoon in late September, Matthew invited Eleanor to join him for a ride to see the countryside beyond Ardmore. Mrs. Porter had given her the afternoon off, as it was the children's music lesson day with the church organist. "I can't ride," Eleanor admitted when Matthew made the suggestion. "That's not a problem," he assured her. "I have a gentle mare who can carry both of us if you don't mind riding behind me." The idea of being so close to Matthew sent a flutter of nervous excitement through Eleanor, but she agreed. They met at the livery stable where Matthew had arranged for the horse a dappled gray mare with kind eyes. "This is Daisy," Matthew introduced, stroking the horse's nose. "She belongs to Mrs. Shaw, but she's letting me borrow her for the day. Daisy's as steady as they come." He showed Eleanor how to mount, then swung up easily in front of her. "Hold onto my waist," he instructed, "and don't worry, I won't let you fall." Eleanor hesitantly placed her hands on either side of his waist, immediately aware of the solid strength beneath her fingertips. As they started moving, she instinctively tightened her hold, bringing her closer against his back. Matthew guided the horse out of town and up into the rolling hills that surrounded Ardmore. The landscape opened before them, vast stretches of prairie grass turned gold by the autumn sun, dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stand of trees. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully across the open range. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed, taking in the expansive vista. "So different from Boston." "Different beautiful," Matthew agreed. "First time I ever saw the ocean, I felt the same way. All that endless water made me understand just how big the world really is." They rode to a high point overlooking much of the surrounding territory. Matthew pointed out landmarks, the ribbon of river that wound through the valley, the distant smudge that was the Lazy S Ranch, and the dark line of trees that marked the border with Indian Territory to the east. "The first time I saw this view," Matthew said as they sat on a sun-warmed rock, the horse grazing nearby, "I was 12 years old. My mother and I had just moved here from Missouri after my father died. I remember thinking it was the loneliest place I'd ever seen." "And now?" Eleanor asked. Matthew smiled, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Now I see possibilities. Good land, good people, room to build something lasting." There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty that made Eleanor look at him more closely. "Is that what you want, to build something lasting?" Matthew turned to meet her gaze, his blue eyes serious. "Yes, someday, when I've saved enough to buy my own piece of land." "You don't want to stay at the Lazy S?" Eleanor asked, surprised. Matthew spoke of his employer with such respect that she had assumed he was content there. "Mr. Shaw is a good man, and I've learned a lot from him," Matthew said. "But a man should stand on his own land eventually, don't you think? Build his own home, raise his own family." The mention of family brought a flush to Eleanor's cheeks, and she looked away, focusing on a hawk circling lazily in the distance. "I think that sounds like a worthy dream." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the breeze playing with Eleanor's hair and carrying the scent of sun-warmed grass and distant rain. Eventually, Matthew pointed to the darkening clouds on the western horizon. "We should head back. That storm will reach us before evening." The ride back was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor found herself hyper-aware of Matthew's solid presence before her, the rhythm of his breathing, the way his body moved in harmony with the horse. She wondered if he was equally aware of her, or if she was simply another friend to him, someone to show kindness to out of his inherent decency. They had nearly reached town when the first fat raindrops began to fall. By the time they reached the livery stable, the rain was coming down in sheets, and both were thoroughly soaked despite their rush to find shelter. Inside the stable, Matthew helped Eleanor down from the horse, his hands strong and sure at her waist. She slipped slightly on the wet floor and he caught her, drawing her closer to steady her. For a breathless moment, they stood that way, his hands at her waist, her palms against his chest, their faces inches apart. Eleanor could see droplets of rain clinging to his eyelashes, could feel the rapid beat of his heart beneath her hand. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and slightly rough. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in them that made her heart race. "Yes." She whispered, hardly daring to breathe. The stable door banged open and James Miller rushed in, shaking rain from his hat. "Matthew, there you are. Shaw's been looking everywhere for you. That new stallion broke through the corral fence and took off with 2 mares. Half the hands are out searching." Matthew stepped back from Eleanor, his expression shifting immediately to concern. About an hour ago, Shaw sent me to town to see if you were still here." James nodded a greeting to Eleanor. "Miss Greenfield, sorry to interrupt your outing." "No apology necessary," Eleanor said, trying to hide her disappointment at the interruption. "It sounds serious." Matthew turned to her, clearly torn between duty and not wanting to abandon her. "Eleanor, I have to go." "Of course you do," she assured him. "I can find my way back to the boarding house. In this downpour?" "No, James can escort you while I get the horse ready." James stepped forward gallantly. "It would be my pleasure, Miss Greenfield." Eleanor wanted to protest that she was perfectly capable of walking a few blocks in the rain, but the genuine concern in Matthew's eyes stopped her. "Thank you, James, that's very kind." As James led her to the stable door, Matthew called after them. "Eleanor, I'll come by tomorrow to make sure you didn't catch cold from our adventure." She turned back with a smile. "I'll look forward to it." The storm continued throughout the night, rattling the windows of the boarding house and sending streams of water coursing down the street gutters. Eleanor sat by the window in her room, watching the lightning illuminate the town in brief, stark flashes, her thoughts on Matthew and the moment that had been interrupted in the stable. Had he been about to kiss her? And if James hadn't burst in, would she have let him? The answer, she knew with absolute certainty, was yes. Despite her caution after the disaster with Douglas Crawford, despite her fears of being hurt again, she would have welcomed Matthew's kiss with her whole heart. The realization both frightened and exhilarated her. Somehow, in the space of a few short weeks, this quiet, honorable cowboy had worked his way past her defenses and into her heart. She only wished she knew whether he felt the same. The next day dawned clear and fresh, the storm having washed the town clean. Eleanor walked to the schoolhouse, carefully navigating around puddles and mud patches. Mrs. Porter greeted her with concern. "My dear, I heard you were caught in that dreadful storm yesterday. You're not ill, I hope." "Not at all," Eleanor assured her, "though I fear my boots may never recover." They laughed together, then turned to preparing the day's lessons. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor found herself watching the clock, wondering when Matthew might come by as he had promised. When school dismissed for the day, there was still no sign of him. Eleanor tried to quell her disappointment as she gathered her things to leave. Perhaps the situation at the ranch had been more serious than anticipated, or perhaps he had simply changed his mind about calling on her. She was halfway back to the boarding house when she spotted Matthew riding down the main street. Even from a distance, she could see that something was wrong. His normally straight posture was slumped, and his clothing was caked with mud. Eleanor hurried to meet him as he dismounted in front of the general store. "Matthew, what happened? Are you hurt?" He turned at the sound of her voice, and Eleanor gasped at the sight of his face. A deep cut ran along his left cheekbone, partially cleaned but still angry-looking. His right eye was swollen and beginning to bruise, and his knuckles were raw and bloody. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said, attempting a smile that turned into a wince. "It looks terrible," Eleanor replied frankly. "Come with me to the boarding house. Rosa has medicinal supplies and you need proper cleaning of those cuts." Matthew looked like he might protest, but then nodded tiredly. "Lead the way." They walked in silence, Matthew leading his horse beside them. At the boarding house, Rosa took one look at Matthew's battered face and hurried to gather her supplies, clucking in disapproval. "Sit," she instructed, pointing to a chair in the kitchen. "Miss Eleanor, bring clean water, please." As Eleanor and Rosa worked together to clean Matthew's wounds, Eleanor finally asked the question burning in her mind. "What happened? Was it the stallion you went to find?" Matthew's jaw tightened. "No, it was Crawford." Eleanor's hands stilled on the cloth she was using to clean his knuckles. Douglas Crawford did this to you? Not alone, Matthew said grimly. He had two of his hands with him. They jumped me when I was checking fence lines near the property border. But why? Eleanor asked, horrified. Because you accompanied me to confront him. Matthew's eyes met hers, their blue intensity undiminished despite his injuries. Partly that, but mostly because Harriet Crawford left him the day after your visit. Seems she did some investigating and found out you were telling the truth about the letters. She's gone back to her father's house and is filing for divorce. Eleanor sank into the chair opposite Matthew, stunned by this revelation. And he blames you, us. He blames everyone but himself, Matthew said wryly. That's the kind of man he is. Rosa finished applying a salve to the cut on Matthew's cheek and stepped back to examine her work. You are lucky this does not need stitches, Mr. Archer, but it will leave a scar, I think. Wouldn't be my first, Matthew said with a slight smile. Thank you for your help, Mrs. Martinez. Rosa patted his shoulder. You are a good man. I will leave you two to talk while I prepare dinner. When she had gone, Eleanor leaned forward to examine Matthew's injuries more closely. I'm so sorry this happened because of me. It's not because of you, Matthew said firmly. Crawford makes his own choices, and if it makes you feel better, he's looking worse than I am right now. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Eleanor found herself smiling at the hint of pride in his voice. You fought back. 3 against 1 weren't great odds, but I managed to land a few good hits before riding off, Matthew confirmed. And Mr. Shaw is furious. He's already sent word to the sheriff about the attack. Eleanor's smile faded as the full implications hit her. Will there be more trouble? Crawford seems dangerous when crossed. Don't worry about Crawford, Matthew said, reaching out to take her hand. He's a coward at heart. Now that the sheriff's involved and word is spreading about what he did to you, his standing in the community is falling fast. He'll be too busy trying to salvage his reputation to cause more problems. The feel of Matthew's rough, warm hand around hers sent a fluttery feeling through Eleanor's chest. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up to meet his steady gaze. There's something I need to tell you, she said quietly. Matthew's expression grew serious. What is it? Yesterday, before James interrupted us. Eleanor paused, gathering her courage. I think you were about to kiss me. A flush crept up Matthew's neck, but he didn't look away. I was. And I wanted you to, Eleanor admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew's hand tightened around hers. Eleanor, I know it's too soon. You came here expecting to marry another man, and I don't want to be someone you turn to just because he hurt you. Is that what you think? Eleanor asked, surprised by the uncertainty in his voice. That I see you as some kind of consolation prize? I don't know what to think, Matthew admitted. I just know that from the moment I saw you at that train station, I haven't been able to get you out of my mind. But I don't want to rush you or pressure you, or Eleanor leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his, effectively silencing his concerns. The kiss was brief and tender, mindful of his injuries, but when she pulled back, the look of wonder in Matthew's eyes made her heart soar. I came to Ardmore expecting to marry a man I thought I knew from his letters, Eleanor said softly. Instead, I met a man who showed me what real honor and kindness look like through his actions. I'm not turning to you because Douglas hurt me, Matthew. I'm turning to you because in knowing you, I've discovered what love should actually feel like. Matthew reached up to touch her cheek, his expression a mixture of awe and tenderness. Eleanor Greenfield, I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment you looked up at me with those tear-filled green eyes and still had the courage to tell me your story. This time when they kissed, it was longer, deeper, a promise of feelings that had grown quietly but steadily over the weeks they'd known each other. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Eleanor couldn't help but laugh softly. What? Matthew asked, smiling despite his split lip. I was just thinking, Eleanor said, that being left at the train station might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. Matthew's smile widened. Remind me to thank Crawford next time I see him, right after I give him another black eye for good measure. Eleanor laughed again, feeling lighter than she had in months. The path that had brought her to Ardmore had been filled with deception and heartbreak, but it had led her to where she was meant to be all along in this kitchen, with this man beginning a story far more beautiful than the one she'd originally imagined. As the golden days of autumn gave way to the crisper air of early winter, Eleanor and Matthew's courtship became the talk of Ardmore. They attended church together on Sundays, took walks in the evenings after Eleanor finished at the school, and occasionally rode out to the Lazy S Ranch on weekends, where Eleanor was warmly welcomed by the Shaws and the other hands. News of Douglas Crawford's disgrace spread throughout the territory. His wife's divorce proceedings revealed not only his duplicity with Eleanor, but similar schemes with at least 2 other women from back east. The banker, Harriet's father, called in several loans, forcing Crawford to sell off portions of his land to cover his debts. By November, rumors circulated that he was considering selling the Triple C entirely and moving to Texas. For Eleanor, these developments brought a sense of justice, but she found she thought of Crawford less and less as her life in Ardmore flourished. Her work at the school brought daily satisfaction. Her friendships with Rosa, Sarah, and others grew deeper, and her relationship with Matthew blossomed in ways that made her previous infatuation with Crawford seem shallow and insubstantial by comparison. One crisp December afternoon, Matthew arrived at the schoolhouse just as Eleanor was dismissing the children for the day. He waited patiently by the door, hat in hand, as she gathered her things. "I thought we might take a walk before dinner," he suggested as they stepped outside into the winter sunshine. "There's something I'd like to show you." Eleanor noticed a certain nervousness in his manner, a slight tension in his shoulders, a careful quality to his smile, but she simply nodded and took the arm he offered. Instead of heading toward town or the boarding house as she expected, Matthew led her down a less traveled path that wound toward the creek where they had stopped after confronting Crawford. The trees were bare now, their branches etched against the clear blue sky, and their footsteps crunched on the light dusting of frost that covered the ground. "Are you going to tell me what this mysterious destination is?" Eleanor asked after they had walked in companionable silence for several minutes. Matthew's smile held a hint of secrecy. "You'll see soon enough." They crested a small rise, and Eleanor gasped in surprise. Below them, in a sheltered hollow near the creek, stood the frame of a small house. The foundation was complete, and the skeleton of walls rose from it, outlining what would clearly become a modest but charming home. "Matthew," Eleanor turned to him questioningly, "what is this?" His eyes shone with pride and something deeper as he gazed at the structure. "It's mine. Or it will be. I've been saving for years to buy land, and when this piece came up for sale last month, 15 acres with creek access and good grazing, I took the chance." "You bought land," Eleanor repeated, joy rising in her chest at the realization that his long-held dream was coming true. "Matthew, that's wonderful, and you're building a house already. James and some of the other hands have been helping on their days off," Matthew explained. "Mr. Shaw gave me some timber from the ranch woodlot as an early Christmas gift. We're hoping to have it closed in before the heavy snows come." Eleanor walked closer to the building site, taking in the details. Though still just a frame, she could see it would be a comfortable 2-bedroom home with a generous front porch overlooking the creek. "Simple, practical, but built with obvious care. It's perfect," she said, turning back to find Matthew watching her intently. He stepped closer, taking both her hands in his. "I hoped you'd think so." He drew a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Eleanor, I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but these past months have shown me everything I need to know about who you are and how I feel about you." Eleanor's heart began to race as Matthew dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands in his. "I'm not a wealthy man," he said, his blue eyes earnest and unwavering. "I can't offer you grand houses or fine things, but I can promise to love you honestly and completely for the rest of my days, to build a good life with you, to cherish you through whatever comes. Eleanor Greenfield, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness sprang to Eleanor's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Matthew Archer, I will marry you. He rose and pulled her into his arms, his kiss filled with promise and joy. When they finally parted, Matthew reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "She made me promise to give it only to a woman who was as strong and kind as she was. I think she would have loved you, Eleanor." The ring fit perfectly, catching the winter sunlight as Eleanor held up her hand to admire it. "I'll wear it with pride," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. They walked around the partially built house, Matthew pointing out where each room would be, Eleanor already envisioning curtains at the windows and flowers in the garden come spring. The future stretched before them, not the future Eleanor had imagined when she first boarded the train to Oklahoma, but one infinitely more precious for being built on true understanding and love. As they began their walk back to town hand in hand, Eleanor glanced back at the house frame silhouetted against the setting sun. "When do you think it will be finished?" she asked. "By spring, I hope," Matthew answered. "In time for a June wedding, if that suits you." Eleanor smiled up at him, her heart full. "It suits me perfectly." Word of their engagement spread quickly through Ardmore, bringing congratulations from friends and acquaintances alike. Mrs. Porter insisted on hosting an engagement dinner at her home, where the couple was toasted by what seemed like half the town. "To think," Sarah Wilson remarked to Eleanor as they helped clear dishes after the celebration, "if that horrible Mr. Crawford had actually met you at the station as promised, you never would have met Matthew." Eleanor glanced across the room to where Matthew was engaged in animated conversation with Mr. Shaw and the town doctor. "I've thought the same thing many times," she admitted. "It's strange how what seems like the worst moment of your life can lead to the best." "It's like my grandmother used to say," Rosa added, joining them with a stack of plates. "God closes a door, but he opens a window. In my case, he opened the door to a whole new life," Eleanor said with a smile. As winter settled fully over the territory, bringing occasional snow and frequent cold winds, work on Matthew's house continued whenever weather permitted. Eleanor found herself spending much of her free time planning for their future home and the wedding. Sarah offered to help make her wedding dress, using the silk from the gown Eleanor had worn to Ardmore, now carefully unpicked and cleaned. "It seems fitting," Eleanor told Matthew one evening as they sat by the fire in Rosa's parlor. "To remake that dress into something new and beautiful, just as my disappointment was remade into happiness." Matthew took her hand, his thumb gently rubbing over her engagement ring. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" "Yes," Eleanor laughed softly, "but I don't mind hearing it again." Their peaceful planning was interrupted in late January when news arrived that Douglas Crawford had been killed in a bar fight in Dallas. According to the reports, he had accused another man of cheating at cards, drawn his gun, but was shot before he could fire. "Can't say I'm sorry," James remarked when he delivered the news to Matthew and Eleanor as they inspected the progress on the house. "Man like that was bound to come to a bad end." Eleanor felt a strange mixture of emotions at the news, not grief, certainly, but a sort of hollow pity for a life so wasted. "It's sad," she said simply. "He could have had a good life if he'd made different choices." Matthew put his arm around her shoulders. "Some men never learn the difference between what truly matters and what doesn't." As winter slowly gave way to spring, the house progressed from a frame to a real home. Walls were raised and finished, a roof was shingled, windows and doors were hung. By April, Matthew was able to move from the bunkhouse at the Lazy S to his own property, though he continued to work for the Shaws while developing his own small herd of cattle. Eleanor visited the house whenever possible, helping to paint walls, hang curtains she had sewn with Rosa's help, and arrange the simple but sturdy furniture Matthew had either made himself or purchased from the town's carpenter. "It's becoming more beautiful every day," she told Matthew as they stood on the front porch one mild spring evening, watching the sunset turn the creek to liquid gold. "It's just waiting for you to make it a home," Matthew replied, pulling her close against his side. On the first Saturday in June 1885, Eleanor Greenfield became a Eleanor Archer in a ceremony at Ardmore's small church. The building overflowed with friends and well-wishers as the couple exchanged vows, Matthew steady and sure in a new suit, Eleanor radiant in her remade gown of ivory silk. "I take you, Eleanor, to be my wedded wife," Matthew's voice rang clear and true through the church. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." As Eleanor repeated the vows, she thought of how far she had come from that tearful afternoon at the train station. The woman who had arrived in Ardmore heartbroken and alone was now surrounded by a community she loved, pledging her life to a man who had proven his worth through actions rather than empty promises. After the ceremony, the entire town seemed to gather for the celebration at the Shaw's ranch. There was music and dancing, a feast of home-cooked food, and enough well wishes to last a lifetime. As evening fell, Matthew and Eleanor slipped away, riding in a flower-bedecked buggy to their new home by the creek. Matthew carried Eleanor across the threshold, setting her down gently in the front room that they had prepared together over the past months. A fire was already burning in the stone fireplace, casting a warm glow over the simple furnishings. "Welcome home, Mrs. Archer," Matthew said softly, his eyes reflecting the firelight and a deeper, more lasting flame. Eleanor reached up to touch his face, still hardly believing that this good, honorable man was now her husband. "I never thought I could be this happy," she whispered. Later, as moonlight streamed through the curtains of their bedroom window, Eleanor lay in the circle of Matthew's arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her cheek. Their coming together had been everything she had dreamed it would be: tender, passionate, and filled with the promise of a lifetime of love. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her bare shoulder. "I'm thinking about that day at the train station," Eleanor admitted. "How lost I felt, how certain I was that my life was over before it had really begun." Matthew's arms tightened around her. "And now?" Eleanor raised herself on one elbow to look down at him, her heart swelling with love at the sight of his dear face in the moonlight. "Now I know it was just beginning." The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure, as all lives do. The small herd of cattle Matthew started with grew steadily under his careful management. Eleanor continued teaching until the birth of their first child, a son they named William Samuel Archer, in the spring of 1887. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Grace Elizabeth, with her mother's green eyes and her father's determined spirit. The house by the creek expanded as the family grew, first a kitchen addition, then another bedroom, finally a proper study where the children could do their lessons under Eleanor's guidance. The land flourished under Matthew's stewardship, and by the turn of the century, the Archer Ranch was known throughout the territory as one of the best-run operations of its size. On a warm evening in June 1900, Matthew and Eleanor sat together on the porch swing he had built for their 5th anniversary, watching their children play in the yard as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. William, now 13, was teaching 10-year-old Grace how to throw a lasso, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. 15 years, Matthew mused, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "It hardly seems possible." 15 years since I sat crying at the Ardmore Station," Eleanor said with a smile, leaning her head against his shoulder. At 40, her honey blonde hair now held strands of silver, and fine lines had formed at the corners of her eyes. But to Matthew, she was more beautiful than ever. "Best thing I ever did was sit down beside you that day," Matthew said, pressing a kiss to her temple. Eleanor turned to look at her husband, taking in the face she knew as well as her own, the laugh lines around his eyes, the scar on his cheekbone from that long-ago fight with Crawford, the silver threading through his dark hair. At 45, he was still the handsome cowboy who had captured her heart, though years of working the land had added new creases to his face and calluses to his hands. "You ever wonder what would have happened if Douglas Crawford had actually met me that day?" Eleanor asked, curious. Matthew considered this for a moment. "Sometimes, I'd like to think I would have found you anyway somehow. Some things are just meant to be." Eleanor smiled, thinking of all the twists and turns that had brought them to this moment, this peaceful evening surrounded by the life they had built together. "I think you're right," she said. "Some things are meant to be." They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the Oklahoma sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The children's game shifted to a chase, their footsteps drumming across the yard as Grace darted away from her brother's reaching hands, her laughter floating back like music on the air. "Mama, Papa, watch me," Grace called, executing a perfect cartwheel that ended with a dramatic bow. Eleanor and Matthew applauded appreciatively, their hearts full at the simple joy of watching their children grow and thrive in this home they had created together. As twilight deepened into dusk, Matthew stood and held out his hand to Eleanor. "Come on, Mrs. Archer. Let's call those young'uns in for supper." Eleanor placed her hand in his, feeling the same spark she had felt the first time their fingers intertwined all those years ago. As they walked together toward their children, she reflected that life had a way of working out as it should not always as planned, and often through paths of unexpected difficulty, but ultimately leading to where one was meant to be. For Eleanor, that place was here in Ardmore, Oklahoma, with the cowboy who had sat beside her on that fateful day and stayed, not just for that moment, but for a lifetime.